For centuries, history has taught us to see women through certain molds: the protective mother, the obedient wife, the pious queen interceding for the poor. That has been at least the official story that chronicles and legends have passed down from generation to generation. An image of virtue, delicacy, and silent sacrifice. But in the shadows of palaces, in the alleys of cities in upheaval, or even on the fields of battle, there were women who broke that mold. Women who did not limit themselves to praying, obeying, or awaiting their fate. Women who chose to wield a dagger, mix a poison, plan an ambush, or carry out a crime with their own hands. And when they did, the impact was devastating, because it was not only a matter of a murder, it was a challenge to the entire social structure that had defined what a woman ought to be. Since antiquity, a recurring figure has provoked as much fear as fascination: the femme fatale. The dangerous woman, seductive, calculating, capable of dragging men to their ruin. We find her in the Bible with Delilah, who betrays Samson, in classical literature with Clytemnestra, who murders her husband Agamemnon, and centuries later in the film noir of the 20th century, embodied by mysterious women who use attraction as their deadliest weapon. This archetype is universal because it touches a very deep nerve: the fear of the unexpected, of transgression, of the power hidden beneath an appearance of fragility. When a man kills in history, chroniclers narrate it as a war, a conquest, an act of power. But when it is a woman who kills, the story changes. Her action not only defies the law, it also defies cultural expectations. Every dagger wielded by a woman seemed to slash apart the social contract that relegated her to silence and obedience. And that is why their crimes, beyond their violence, have been etched with particular intensity in the collective memory. On this journey, we will explore the lives and crimes of 10 of the most infamous female killers in history. Women who, out of ambition, vengeance, ideology, or sheer brutality, left a mark impossible to erase. Some belonged to the highest courts, surrounded by luxury and palace conspiracies. Others emerged from misery on society's margins and turned pain into violence. We will visit imperial Rome, where a mother poisoned an emperor to secure her son's power. We will pass through revolutionary France, where a young provincial woman stabbed one of the most influential leaders of her time in his bath. We will step into the halls of a Hungarian castle, the setting of one of the most horrifying serial murder cases ever attributed to a woman. We will also travel to samurai Japan to discover a warrior who decapitated her enemies in single combat, and to 20th century India, where a peasant woman, humiliated and abused, transformed her suffering into a massacre that still divides opinion. 10 stories separated by centuries and cultures, yet united by a common thread: the rupture of expectations, the challenge to the established order, the fear unleashed when a woman takes into her own hands the decision to kill. This is not a comfortable or sugar-coated tour. It is a descent into the darkest side of history, where beauty, cunning, or desperation blend with violence. Stories where crime becomes a weapon of power, and where these killers not only took lives, but in some cases altered the very course of empires. Join us on this journey across the centuries, a voyage that will take us from the Bible to the French Revolution, from Tsarist Russia to 1920s New York. Because these are the 10 women who, with a dagger, with poison, or with a shot, changed history forever. Case 1. Charlotte Corday, France, 1793. The summer of 1793 marked one of the darkest moments of the French Revolution. The public squares of Paris had become stages of blood, where the guillotine worked without rest. The air was thick with fear and suspicion. No one was safe from being denounced as a traitor to the homeland. Amid that climate of terror, a young provincial woman named Charlotte Corday decided that a single violent act could save her country, even if it cost her life. Charlotte Corday was born in Normandy in 1768. Orphaned from a very young age, she spent part of her childhood in a convent, where she received an uncommon education for a woman of her time. There she read the classics and the Enlightenment philosophers, and developed a political vision that would soon set her apart from the passive role expected of her. When the revolution broke out, Corday embraced reformist ideas, but sided with the Girondin faction, moderate compared with the radicalism of the Jacobins. The Girondins, who had advocated a more decentralized and less violent republic, were quickly cornered by their Jacobin rivals, led by figures such as Robespierre, Danton, and above all, Jean-Paul Marat. Marat was a fiery journalist, author of incendiary pamphlets demanding blood, more blood, to purify the Republic. His writings, drafted from the bathtub where he spent most of his time because of a painful skin disease, were read as calls for mass execution. For Charlotte Corday, Marat was not a revolutionary hero, but a monster who had turned liberty into butchery. In July of 1793, when Jacobin violence reached its height and dozens of Girondins were being arrested or executed, Corday made a definitive decision. She traveled to Paris, carrying a kitchen knife hidden beneath her clothes. Her plan was simple and at the same time almost suicidal: to assassinate Marat and thereby halt the bloody spiral devouring France. On the 13th of July, Charlotte managed to gain access to the journalist's house on the Rue des Cordeliers. She pretended to have information about Girondin conspiracies in Caen and requested a direct audience with him. Marat, who received visitors in his bathtub because of his ailments, agreed to hear her. As he took note of the name she offered, Charlotte drew the knife and plunged it into his chest, piercing in a single blow the heart of the most feared man in Paris. Marat died almost instantly, dropping his pen and his list of accused into water now tinged with blood. The impact was immediate. The news spread like wildfire. For the Jacobins, Marat became a martyr of the revolution, a victim sacrificed for the cause. The painter Jacques-Louis David immortalized the scene in a canvas that today is one of the most powerful symbols of revolutionary art, the death of Marat. In it, the leader appears serene, almost Christ-like, as if he had given his life for the people's freedom. Charlotte, for her part, did not attempt to flee. She was arrested on the spot and subjected to a summary trial. Far from showing remorse, she firmly defended her crime. She declared that she had killed one man to save 100,000, convinced that with Marat's disappearance the revolutionary massacre would end. Her composure and proud bearing in court surprised even her accusers. On the 17th of July, barely 4 days after the assassination, Charlotte Corday was led to the guillotine. She wore a red blouse, a symbol reserved for those convicted of murder. According to witnesses, she climbed the scaffold without trembling and even smiled at the executioner. Her last words affirmed that she had fulfilled her duty to France. The blade fell amid the applause of some and the outrage of others. Far from stemming the violence, Charlotte Corday's act intensified it. The Jacobins used Marat's death as a pretext to harden the terror even further, multiplying executions and crushing any opposition. What she had conceived as a heroic sacrifice became, in fact, a catalyst for more blood. Today, more than 2 centuries later, Charlotte Corday remains an ambivalent figure. For some, she is the angel of liberty, a woman who dared to defy Jacobin tyranny. For others, she was nothing more than a killer who made a fatal mistake in believing that a crime could stop the violence of an unbridled revolution. What is certain is that her act left an indelible mark on history. A 25-year-old who, with a single knife and an instant of resolve, forever changed the course of the French Revolution. Case 2. Wu Zetian and the Tang Court, China, 7th century. On the vast stage of Chinese history, few figures have been as controversial and at the same time as decisive as Wu Zetian. In a world ruled by emperors, generals, and learned men, she broke every rule by becoming the only woman to bear the official title of Emperor of China. And she did so amid palace intrigues, carefully woven alliances, and according to contemporary chroniclers, a chain of murders that cleared rivals from her path. Wu Zetian was born in the year 624 into a relatively well-off family. Her fate seemed limited to a secondary role at court, as one of the many concubines who served Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty. However, from a very young age, she displayed an uncommon combination of intelligence, ambition, and strategic coldness. Unlike other women confined to the harem, Wu knew how to use her position to observe the machinery of power, learn from the bureaucrats, and discover how the delicate balance among court factions worked. After Taizong's death, Wu did not vanish into the shadows as custom dictated. Instead of retiring to a Buddhist convent, she achieved something nearly unthinkable. returning to the palace as concubine to his successor Gaozong, and soon afterward becoming his principal consort. The official history says that, along the way, she did not hesitate to eliminate those who stood in the way of her ascent. The most disturbing episode related by the chroniclers is the death of one of her own newborn daughters. According to sources hostile to Wu, the child was smothered in her cradle, and Wu blamed Empress Wang, her rival on the throne. The resulting scandal brought about Wang's downfall and cleared the way for Wu to become the most powerful woman at court. Was Wu truly responsible for her daughter's death, or was it an accusation fabricated by Confucian chroniclers, enemies of the idea of a woman ruler? It is hard to know for certain. What is indisputable is that from that moment, Wu Zetian did not stop. She consolidated her position by removing political rivals through poisonings, exiles, and at times brutal executions. High officials who doubted her legitimacy were accused of treason and eliminated without hesitation. And yet reducing Wu Zetian solely to a figure of blood would be unfair. During Gaozong's reign, and especially after his death, when she stood as Empress Regent and finally as Emperor of China in the year 690, Wu undertook reforms of tremendous significance. She strengthened the imperial bureaucracy and promoted the civil service examination system, which allowed talented men from non-aristocratic families to rise in the administration. She favored Buddhism over Confucianism, winning the support of monks and intellectuals. And above all, she maintained an iron grip over an empire that stretched from Korea to Central Asia. The contrast between her ruthlessness and her political vision has made Wu Zetian a fascinating figure. On one hand, the Black Legend presents her as a merciless killer, capable even of sacrificing her own children for power. On the other, historical records show that under her government, the Tang dynasty reached one of its most stable and prosperous stages. She was a feared ruler, yes, but also respected and in many cases effective. After nearly half a century in power, Wu Zetian was forced to abdicate in the year 705, shortly before her death. The Confucian historians who wrote after her portrayed her as a monster, an example of what happens when a woman dares to usurp power reserved for men. But time has softened that view. Today, she is recognized as one of the great political figures of Chinese history, whose ambition and cruelty intertwined with a real capacity to govern. Wu Zetian left a contradictory legacy, a murderer to some, a visionary to others. The truth is that she was both. She knew how to use fear and crime as political tools, but she also left an institutional imprint that survived for centuries beyond her death. Her story reminds us that, on the chessboard of power, few pieces were as unexpected and as decisive as the woman who, in the 7th century, dared to call herself Emperor of China. Case 3. Erzsébet Báthory, Hungary, 16th century. In the heart of Europe, in a time marked by wars, religious intrigues, and dynastic rivalries, a Hungarian noblewoman became the protagonist of one of history's darkest legends. Her name was Erzsébet Báthory, but posterity would remember her by a far more sinister title, the Bloody Countess. Erzsébet was born in 1560 into one of Hungary's most powerful families. The Báthorys were an influential lineage, related to princes and kings, capable of tipping the region's political balance. From childhood, Erzsébet received an uncommon education. She spoke Latin and German, knew law and administration, and moved with ease in the rigid aristocratic court. At 15, she married Count Ferenc Nudisty, a distinguished military man known as the Black Hero of Hungary for his ferocity in the wars against the Ottomans. Together they settled in Koktész Castle, a fortress that, in time, would become synonymous with horror. After her husband's death in 1604, Erzsébet was left a widow at just 44 and in control of vast properties. It was during this period that rumors began to circulate, soon turning into formal accusations. Young peasant girls sent into her service disappeared without a trace. Families grew suspicious, but the Báthory power shielded the countess from any serious investigation. Over time, the testimonies became more concrete. Maids, neighbors, and priests spoke of tortures in the castle dungeons. Beatings, burnings, cuts with blades, mutilations, and even the practice of biting the victim's flesh were described in court proceedings. The numbers still chill today. Some documents mention dozens of deaths, others more than 600. Although it is very likely that these figures were exaggerated, the magnitude of the accusations was enough to shake the entire kingdom. It was in this context that the most famous legend was born, that of the blood baths. According to popular tales, Erzsébet discovered that when she brutally whipped a maid, the blood that stained her skin restored a more youthful look. Convinced she had found the secret of eternal youth, she allegedly ordered maidens to be drained so she could bathe in their blood. Although historians agree that this part of the story was probably an exaggeration or even a later invention, the image of the countess immersed in a red bath remained forever fixed in the collective imagination. The judicial reality, however, was less theatrical and more political. For years, the complaints against Erzsébet were ignored because of her lineage. But by 1610, when the deaths could no longer be concealed, King Matthias II decided to act. A group of nobles stormed Chagatáy's castle and, according to the chronicles, found corpses and tortured young women. The ensuing trial was extraordinary. More than 300 testimonies were collected, some of them terrifying, describing in detail the countess's alleged methods. Yet Erzsébet was never subjected to a direct trial. In part, her aristocratic position protected her. Condemning a woman of her rank to death would have set a dangerous precedent for the nobility. Instead, a peculiar sentence was handed down. Erzsébet was confined in her own castle, walled up in one of its rooms where she spent her final years. She died in 1614, isolated from the world and already become legend. Erzsébet Bathory's story has been reinterpreted again and again. For some, she was a serial killer whose cruelty knew no bounds. For others, she was the victim of a political conspiracy aimed at seizing her lands and wealth by exaggerating or inventing her crimes. The combination of court testimony, popular myth, and the morbid allure of blood-soaked tales turned her figure into an archetype of terror. Her cultural legacy is undeniable. Erzsébet inspired Bram Stoker in shaping his Dracula and, over time, became a symbol of corrupt and decadent aristocracy feeding on the poorest. Literature, film, and music have recreated her figure time and again, halfway between history and legend. Erzsébet Bathory embodies the fascination with female violence in a male-dominated world. Her story, real or magnified, reminds us how power, cruelty, and myth can intertwine until they create an immortal character. The Bloody Countess lives on in the collective memory not so much for what she truly did, as for what the imagination of later generations decided she had done. Case 4. Phulan Devi, the Bandit Queen, India, 20th century. In the vast and complex history of India, few figures have generated as much controversy as Phulan Devi. For some, she was a ruthless killer, a criminal who unleashed an unforgettable massacre. For others, she was a symbol of resistance, the woman who rose up against a feudal and patriarchal system that had made her a victim from childhood. The truth is that her life, marked by violence, vengeance, and political power, reads more like a tragic epic than the biography of a peasant born into misery. Phulan Devi was born in 1963 into a humble family of the Malla caste, considered low in India's rigid social hierarchy. Her childhood was marked by hardship, grueling labor, and fierce inequality. At 11, she was forced to marry a much older man, a child marriage that quickly became a nightmare. Abused and abandoned, Phulan returned to her village already bearing the stigma of a rejected wife. Poverty and caste tensions worsened her plight. In her youth, Phulan was repeatedly sexually abused both within her family environment and beyond. This context of relentless violence pushed her toward an unexpected fate, joining a band of dacoits, the feared rural bandits who operated in northern India in the region of Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh. The dacoits, half guerrillas, half outlaws, lived outside the law, defying both authorities and local landlords. In that brutal environment, Phulan first found more violence. She was again mistreated by members of the gang, but she also found allies. One of them, Vikram Malla, a bandit of a low caste like her, took her under his protection. Over time, Phulan ceased to be a passive victim and became a leader. She forged a reputation as an implacable woman, capable of planning ambushes and settling scores with those who had humiliated her. The episode that defined her life and turned her into myth was the so-called Bamai massacre in 1981. After being kidnapped and raped repeatedly by men of high castes in that village, Fulin returned months later with her band. She gathered dozens of men in the square and, in a brutal act of vengeance, ordered the execution of more than 20 of them. The event shocked the entire country. For some, it was an atrocious crime. For others, the justice of a woman who dared to strike back in a society that had always protected the powerful. From then on, Fulin became a legend. The press dubbed her the Bandit Queen, and her face became synonymous with defiance of the established order. For 2 years, she remained on the run, hiding in the forests and protected by sympathizers who saw her as a kind of folk avenger. Finally, in 1983, after complex negotiations and with the promise of relatively lenient treatment, Fulin Devi surrendered to the authorities. She spent 11 years in pre-trial detention without a trial until she was released in 1994. What came next was astonishing. Far from being marginalized, Fulin entered politics. Capitalizing on her fame, she was elected a member of parliament for the Samajwadi Party in 1996, representing peasant communities and lower castes. In parliament, she defended the rights of the marginalized and, paradoxically, became an institutional figure in the very society that had once pursued her. However, her past never stopped haunting her. On the 25th of July, 2001, as she returned to her residence in New Delhi, she was gunned down by armed men. The crime was attributed to revenge tied to the Bamai massacre, a reminder that the open wounds of that act of vengeance had never fully healed. Fulin Devi remains profoundly ambivalent. To many, she was a criminal who stained her hands with the blood of innocents. To others, she was a heroine who personified the rage of millions of poor and humiliated women who found in her a symbol of resistance. Her story, poised between violence and political redemption, between victim and executioner, illustrates the complexity of the female condition in a world marked by gender and caste inequality. In the end, Fulin Devi was neither a simple bandit nor a simple parliamentarian. She was both. Her life shows how the line between justice and vengeance can blur, and how a woman buried alive by poverty and violence could, for a time, crown herself queen of her own fate, even if her end was once again steeped in blood. Case 5. Agrippina the Younger, Rome, 1st century. In the heart of the Roman Empire, where absolute power mingled with poison and treachery, few figures shone as brightly and fell as brutally as Agrippina the Younger. A member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, niece of one emperor, sister of another, wife of a third, and mother of Nero, she was a protagonist of one of the most turbulent periods in Roman history. Her name is linked to ambition, political manipulation, and a fate marked by blood. Agrippina was born in the year 15 after Christ, daughter of the brilliant general Germanicus and of Agrippina the Elder. From childhood, she knew what power meant, and also the fragility of imperial bonds. Her brother Caligula ascended the throne and surrounded her with luxury and privilege, but also with suspicion. In that world of intrigue, Agrippina learned to move cautiously, cultivating alliances and strengthening her influence in the palace corridors. Her life was marked by strategic marriages. The second, to the consul Gaius Crispus Passienus, endowed her with an enormous fortune. But her greatest political move was without doubt her union with Emperor Claudius, her own uncle, in the year 49. To Rome, it was a scandalous marriage, but for Agrippina, it represented the chance to place her son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the future Nero, in the line of succession. Roman chroniclers, especially Tacitus and Suetonius, suggest that she plotted Claudius's death. In the year 54, the emperor died after eating a dish of mushrooms. Rumors claimed that Agrippina had poisoned the mushrooms to ensure her son's coronation. There was never definitive proof, but the speed with which Nero was proclaimed emperor fed the suspicion that his mother's hand lay behind that sudden end. Having become the most powerful woman in Rome, Agrippina did not settle for the role of emperor's mother. During Nero's early years, she was the true sovereign. She sat beside him in official audiences, appeared on imperial coins, and gave orders in his name. Her influence was so evident that many senators and generals knew that, in reality, Rome was being ruled by a woman. But that dominance had a price. Nero, young and impulsive, soon began to resent his mother's ever-present shadow. What began as a bond of protection and alliance turned into a power struggle. Agrippina did not hesitate to confront her son when she believed his decisions jeopardized the legacy she had fought to secure. Nero, for his part, saw in her an obstacle to be eliminated. The outcome was worthy of a Roman tragedy. According to the accounts, Nero planned his mother's death several times, first by poison, then through traps. It is even said that he ordered a boat to be built to sink with Agrippina on board. But she survived each attempt. Finally, in the year 59, Nero decided to end the ambiguity. He sent soldiers to Agrippina's villa at Misenum. When they surrounded her and dealt the first blow, the emperor's mother cried out a phrase immortalized in Roman memory: "Strike my womb, there where Nero once was." It was her final defiance, a reminder that even at the moment of her death, she remained the one who had given life to the emperor. Agrippina's figure has been interpreted in contradictory ways. To some Roman chroniclers, she was a monstrous mother, a woman driven by ambition who did not hesitate to murder in order to place her son on the throne. To others, she was a victim of her own political game, trapped in a web of intrigues where survival required being as ruthless as the men around her. Looking back today, Agrippina the Younger embodies that paradox. Was she the protector of a son who knew no gratitude, or the murderess who forged one of Rome's most feared emperors? What is certain is that her life, marked by power, poison, and betrayal, reminds us how imperial Rome was a stage where family love and ambition could become indistinguishable. Case 6. Fanny Kaplan, Russia, 1918. The year 1918 was one of the most convulsive in Russia's history. Barely months had passed since the October Revolution, when the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, had seized power. The Tsarist Empire had collapsed, but what emerged in its place was still uncertain. A country devastated by World War, torn by hunger, and on the brink of a civil war that would pit brothers against brothers. In that landscape of chaos and hope, a woman named Fanny Kaplan decided that her mission in life was to kill Lenin. Fanny Kaplan was no stranger in revolutionary circles. Born Faiga Roitblatt into a poor Jewish family in Volhynia, in present-day Ukraine, she joined anarchist and socialist movements opposed to the Tsarist regime from a very young age. At 16, she was arrested for her participation in an attack against an imperial governor. Sentenced to hard labor in Siberia, she spent more than a decade in extreme conditions, which left her with physical and psychological sequelae. There, she lost much of her sight. She was practically blind in one eye and had severely reduced vision in the other. Upon her release after the February Revolution of 1917, Kaplan joined the Socialist Revolutionaries, known as the SRs, a party initially allied with the Bolsheviks, but soon in conflict with them. To Kaplan and her comrades, Lenin was not a liberator, but a dictator in the making who had betrayed the revolution by dissolving the Constituent Assembly and signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. In their eyes, the Bolsheviks had usurped the dream of freedom and were turning it into a tyranny even more dangerous than the Tsarist one. On the 30th of August, 1918, Lenin gave a speech at a factory in Moscow. As he left, surrounded by workers and sympathizers, Kaplan awaited him. Despite her poor vision, she approached close enough to draw a revolver and fire 3 times. One bullet struck Lenin's shoulder, another grazed his neck, and a third embedded in his arm. Lenin fell wounded and bleeding, but did not die. He was rushed for treatment, and doctors managed to save his life. However, he would never fully recover from those wounds. From then on, his health deteriorated, leading to paralysis and his early death in 1924. Kaplan was arrested immediately. Before her interrogators, she confessed to the attempt without showing remorse. She declared that she had acted alone, out of political conviction, because she considered Lenin a traitor to the revolution. Her words were clear. "I considered Lenin a traitor to the revolution, and that is why I shot him." The impact of the attack was enormous. For the Bolsheviks, it was the definitive sign that their enemies were willing to destroy them. That same day, another Bolshevik leader, Moisei Uritsky, had been assassinated in Petrograd. The two events combined set off alarms. The regime felt surrounded by conspiracies and decided to respond with the most brutal violence. Thus was born what would be known as the Red Terror, a wave of repression that included mass arrests, summary executions, and persecution of anyone suspected of sympathizing with the SRs, the Mensheviks, or the old Tsarist regime. Kaplan, for her part, did not receive a formal trial. Barely 3 days after the attempt, on the 3rd of September, 1918, she was summarily executed by the Cheka, the Bolshevik political police. Accounts vary. Some say she was shot, others that she was taken to a prison yard and executed in silence. Her body was never returned, and according to certain versions, it was secretly incinerated so that no remains would exist that might become a symbol of resistance. Fanny Kaplan's story has been marked by ambiguity. To the Bolsheviks and their heirs, she was little more than a terrorist, blind in every sense, unable to understand the course of history. To others, she was a martyr of the betrayed revolution, a woman who, despite physical frailty and years of suffering, had the courage to confront the most powerful man in Russia. What is certain is that, with 3 shots, Fanny Kaplan not only wounded Lenin, but also transformed the fate of the Russian Revolution. Her attack became the perfect pretext to unleash unprecedented repression in which tens of thousands died. And although her name today is not as remembered as those of other protagonists of that era, her act marked a point of no return, the beginning of the regime of terror that would consolidate Bolshevik power for decades. Case 7. Delilah, Biblical Tradition, 11th century BCE. Few female figures have had such symbolic force in the cultural history of the West as Delilah, whose name for centuries has been associated with betrayal, seduction, and the hero's fall. Her story appears in the Book of Judges in the Hebrew Bible and is set in a time of constant conflict between the Israelites and the Philistines, around the 11th century before the Common Era. The protagonist of this tale is Samson, judge of Israel and a fearsome warrior whose superhuman strength allowed him to defeat entire armies with his bare hands. The Bible explains that this strength came from his status as a Nazirite, a man consecrated to God under a special vow that included the prohibition against cutting his hair. The length of his mane was the physical symbol of his bond with the divine and at the same time the source of his power. It is in this context that Delilah appears. The biblical text tells us little about her origin, though tradition has identified her as a Philistine. What is clear is that her role in the story would be decisive. The Philistine rulers, desperate to stop Samson, turned to her. They offered her a large sum of money if she could discover the secret of his strength and deliver him into their hands. Delilah then practiced the oldest strategy of seduction, persistence, the game of trust, emotional manipulation. 3 times she asked Samson where his strength came from, and 3 times he deceived her with false answers. But Delilah did not give up. According to the biblical account, she pestered him day after day with her pleas until Samson, exhausted and trusting, finally confessed the truth. If his hair were cut, he would lose his strength. What followed is one of the Bible's best-known scenes. While Samson slept on her lap, Delilah called a man to cut the 7 braids of his hair. Upon waking, Samson discovered that his power had left him. Delilah then delivered him to the Philistines, who captured him, gouged out his eyes, and took him prisoner to Gaza, where they chained him and forced him to labor as a slave. Delilah did not kill him with her own hands, but her betrayal was the direct cause of Samson's humiliation, torture, and ultimately his death. In Christian, Jewish, and even Islamic tradition, Delilah has stood as a symbol of the dangerous woman, capable of felling the strongest man through cunning, desire, and deceit. Delilah's figure has echoed immensely through Western culture. Since the Middle Ages, her name served as a moral warning in sermons and treatises, the seductress who corrupts the righteous man. In art, her story has been represented in countless paintings, frescoes, and sculptures. Caravaggio, Rubens, and Rembrandt portrayed the cutting of the hair with searing drama, the sleeping hero, the woman leaning over him, the scissors poised to seal the betrayal. In literature, Delilah became the archetype of the femme fatale, the woman who combines beauty and betrayal, sweetness and death. From Baroque tragedies to Romanticism and later the 19th century novel, her shadow looms behind characters like Mérimée Carmen or the vampiric seductresses of Gothic fiction. Even in 20th century film noir, the fatal woman who lures the protagonist to ruin is in part Delilah's heiress. What is interesting is that some modern studies have reinterpreted her story. In a male-dominated world, Delilah was a woman who, like many others of her time, had no political or military power. Her only resource was cunning. From this perspective, her betrayal is not only an act of wickedness, but also an exercise in survival within a context of constant violence. Nonetheless, the dominant tradition preferred to see her as the embodiment of feminine deceit, reinforcing distrust toward women who stepped outside the expected role of obedient wives and mothers. Thus, Delilah is one of the earliest and most influential examples of a female killer or betrayer in cultural history. She did not wield a sword on the battlefield nor lead a rebellion, but with a pair of scissors and a lie, she achieved what no army could. She defeated Israel's strongest hero, and in doing so, she left an indelible mark on the West's memory, forever synonymous with feminine treachery. Case 8. Vera Zasulich, Russia, 1878. In 19th century Russia, political repression and growing social inequality had created an explosive atmosphere. Tsar Alexander II, initially known as the Reforming Tsar for abolishing serfdom in 1861, had seen how his timid reforms stirred even greater expectations among liberal and revolutionary sectors. But when these demands intensified, the state's response was to harden censorship, surveil opponents, and punish with brutality those who dared to question autocracy. It was in this setting that a woman named Vera Zasulich became, unexpectedly, a symbol of the struggle against power. Vera was born in 1849 into an impoverished noble family. From a young age, she was exposed to the revolutionary ideas circulating among mid-century Russian intellectuals. Like many women of her generation, she was drawn to nihilism, a cultural and political movement that rejected traditional structures, the church, the monarchy, the patriarchal family, in pursuit of a radical transformation of society. Her participation in clandestine circles and contact with propagandists made her a target of the Tsarist police, who detained her several times. The trigger for her most famous action came in 1877, with an episode that outraged public opinion. A young revolutionary named Alexei Bogolyubov, imprisoned for political reasons, was brutally beaten in jail by order of General Fyodor Trepov, the military governor of St. Petersburg. The punishment, apparently for a minor disciplinary offense, became a symbol of the regime's arbitrariness and cruelty. Vera Zasulich decided to avenge that humiliation. On the 24th of January, 1878, she presented herself at Trepov's office with a revolver hidden beneath her clothes. Pretending to have an administrative matter, she managed to reach him. Without hesitation, she fired at point-blank range, wounding him gravely. Then, she did not flee. She turned herself in immediately, declaring that she had acted in defense of the Russian people. The trial that followed was a political earthquake. Far from a routine proceeding, it became a public debate about the legitimacy of autocratic power and citizens' right to resist tyranny. Her defense was undertaken by the celebrated lawyer Peter Alexandrov, who presented Zasulich not as a criminal, but as a woman moved by justice and moral indignation at the state's brutality. The verdict surprised everyone. The jury, swayed by public pressure and by evidence of governmental arbitrariness, acquitted her. The courtroom erupted in applause, and the news swept across Russia. A woman had attempted to kill one of the Tsar's most powerful representatives and walked free. For many, it was a moral victory against despotism. Zasulich's acquittal had deep consequences. First, it marked a milestone in the perception of women within revolutionary movements. Until then, the female figure had been associated more with motherhood or social charity. Vera showed that a woman could act with the same political determination and the same violence as her male comrades. She became an example for many young women who, in the following decades, joined terrorist groups seeking to end autocracy, such as Narodnaya Volya, responsible for Tsar Alexander II's assassination in 1881. Second, the case prompted a change in the state's strategy. If a woman could become a public heroine after shooting a high official, then tighter control was necessary. In subsequent years, the Tsarist regime further restricted political freedoms and pursued revolutionaries with greater ferocity. Vera Zasulich, however, did not remain on the path of terrorism. After the trial, she spent time in European exile, where she met key socialist figures such as Karl Marx and Georgy Plekhanov. Over time, she became an influential intellectual in the Russian Marxist movement, helping to found the Emancipation of Labor Group, the seed of what would later become the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The memory of her 1878 attack, however, never faded. It was the episode that made her a myth, the young revolutionary who, revolver in hand, defied the Tsar's power and emerged acquitted thanks to popular support. Her figure straddled the line between criminal and heroine, between a desperate act of violence and political courage. Thus, Vera Zasulich occupies a unique place in the history of violent or murderous women. She did not act from personal ambition, jealousy, or private revenge, but for a political ideal. Her bullet was aimed not at a private enemy, but at what despotic power represented. And with it, she changed not only the perception of women in the revolutionary struggle, but also the history of the workers' movement in Russia itself. Case 9. Ruth Snyder, United States 1927. In 1920s New York, a city buzzing with jazz, automobiles, electric lights, and prohibition, another phenomenon reigned: press sensationalism. Newspapers competed for stories of crime, sex, and scandal that sold like hotcakes at the newsstands. In this context, the case of Ruth Snyder became one of the most media-saturated and remembered in American criminal history. Ruth Brown Snyder did not, at first glance, seem destined for headlines. A Queens housewife married to a magazine editor named Albert Snyder, she led a life that appeared ordinary. But behind that facade was a marriage marked by lovelessness and frustration. Ruth felt her husband was cold, authoritarian, and emotionally distant. The appearance of a lover, a sporting goods salesman named Henry Judd Gray, was the spark that ignited tragedy. Together they began to plot a plan to murder Albert Snyder and collect a life insurance policy that Ruth had gotten him to sign under suspicious circumstances with a double indemnity clause in the event of accidental death. The sum was considerable for the time, $50,000, which today would amount to nearly $1 million. On the 20th of March, 1927, Ruth and Judd Gray put their plan into action at the Queen's house. The scene was clumsy and violent. Gray tried to strangle Albert with a cord but lacked the strength. Ruth struck him with a heavy object, and finally the two of them asphyxiated him with gas. Afterward, they tried to stage a robbery, ransacking the house and tying up Ruth to make her look like the victim of the assault. The problem was that the staging was so unconvincing that the police suspected them from the start. In her first statement, Ruth contradicted herself. Investigators noticed that the crime scene was poorly faked. Soon the evidence pointed to her and Gray, and under interrogation they quickly blamed each other. The extramarital affair, the life insurance policy, and the lack of alibis sank them. The trial was a spectacle. The press followed it day by day, exploiting every lurid detail: Ruth's coldness, Gray's pusillanimity, the clandestine passion between them, and above all, the prurient fascination with a woman who had planned to kill her husband. Yellow papers like the Daily News turned Ruth into a figure of both fascination and repulsion, the treacherous wife, the modern Black Widow. The conviction was inevitable. Both were sentenced to die in Sing Sing's electric chair. Gray accepted his fate with resignation, but it was Ruth who drew all the media attention in her final moments. And here her case took on a unique dimension in journalism's history. On the 12th of January, 1928, Ruth Snyder was executed. Among the witnesses was a Daily News reporter named Tom Howard, who managed to smuggle in a small camera strapped to his ankle with a special device. At the instant the current coursed through Ruth's body, Howard triggered the hidden shutter. The photograph, blurry but unmistakable, showed Ruth's body at the moment of death. The next day, it filled the entire front page of the paper with a gigantic headline: "Dead." It was an unprecedented sales success. Millions of copies were distributed in New York and beyond, and the image became one of the most shocking in 20th century photojournalism. The photo ignited an intense debate about the limits of the press and the use of morbid spectacle to sell news. Some considered it an assault on human dignity, while others defended the public's right to see the truth without filters. It undoubtedly marked a before and after in media culture. It proved that female crime, when amplified by scandalous images, could become a mass phenomenon. The case of Ruth Snyder left not only the story of a poorly planned marital murder, but also a reflection on the role of the press, the exploitation of morbid curiosity, and the way 1920s society consumed stories of female killers as if they were part of the spectacle. Ruth entered history not only as a criminal, but as the protagonist of the first major photograph of an execution in the United States, an image still studied in schools of journalism and criminology. Case 10, Tomoe Gozen, Japan, 12th century. In the Japanese medieval imagination, few figures have achieved as much legendary force as Tomoe Gozen, a woman samurai who fought during the Genpei Wars, 1180 to 1185, a conflict that marked the end of the Heian era and the rise of the Minamoto shogunate. Although historical chronicles weave facts together with epic elements, Tomoe's memory has remained alive for more than 800 years, not only as a warrior, but as a symbol that women too could draw the sword and decide a battle's outcome. The Heike Monogatari, the great chronicle of that war, describes her in words that combine beauty and brutality. Tomoe was especially beautiful, with white skin, long hair, and delicate features. She was also a first-class archer, and as a swordswoman, she was a warrior worth 1,000, ready to face demons or gods on foot or on horseback. This description reveals much about how she is perceived, not remembered as a victim or an obedient wife, but as a complete warrior, capable of equaling and sometimes surpassing men on the battlefield. She served the Minamoto clan under the direct orders of Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a leader who fought his own relatives in a fratricidal war for control of Japan. Tomoe was no mere companion. She is mentioned commanding troops, leading cavalry charges, and engaging in single combat with renowned enemy warriors. Her presence was not symbolic but military and real. The most famous episode attributed to her occurred at the Battle of Awazu in 1184. According to the account, when Yoshinaka's army was being defeated by the forces of Minamoto no Yoritomo, Tomoe refused to flee. Mounted on horseback with her naginata, a polearm with a curved blade, she searched among the throng of enemies for a warrior worthy of facing her. She found Honda no Morishige, a feared samurai, and decapitated him in single combat. In other versions, the victim was Uchida Ieyoshi, whom she likewise defeated in a brutal duel. The chronicles differ in detail, but all agree that Tomoe stood firm even in defeat. Some narratives claim that Yoshinaka, her lord, ordered her to withdraw so she would not die at his side, fearing the shame it would bring upon his lineage for a woman to fall on the battlefield. Others say she herself chose to fight to the end, though she disappeared from the chronicles immediately after Awazu. Her ultimate fate remains a mystery. Some believe she died in battle, others that she was captured and forced to retire, and still others that she became a nun to atone for bloodshed. Beyond uncertain details, what is undeniable is that Tomoe Gozen became a cultural icon. She appears in Noh and Kabuki theater, in ukiyo-e prints, in novels, and in contemporary manga. She represents a singular archetype, the woman warrior who combines beauty and ferocity, tenderness and cruelty. In a society as marked by gender roles as medieval Japan, her story defied expectations. It is true that Tomoe was not a killer in the criminal sense, like Ruth Snyder or Charlotte Corday. Her realm was war, and in that context, death was not a crime but a duty. Nonetheless, her name appears alongside the most famous female killers because her ability to behead enemies in single combat made her an implacable executioner, as feared as she was admired. Her legacy transcends the military. For contemporary Japan, Tomoe Gozen embodies the idea that the samurai spirit was not exclusive to men. Her example was invoked centuries later when women of the Aizu domain, during the Boshin War in the 19th century, took up arms in defense of their families. And even today, her image inspires novels, video games, and films that reimagine the samurai who rode into chaos with the same boldness as any warrior. Tomo Gozen remains at the boundary between history and legend. Perhaps chroniclers exaggerated her feats. Perhaps we will never know her true end. But her mere mention in the Heike Monogatari is enough to remind us that even in the most rigid societies, there were women who drew the sword and changed the course of history. We have traveled through 10 stories that cross cultures, centuries, and contexts, yet share a common thread. They are all accounts of women who, in one way or another, broke with the role society had imposed on them. Charlotte Corday, the young woman who stabbed Marat in the midst of the French Revolution, believing she could halt the violence and ending up feeding it. Wu Zetian, who from the Tang court eliminated rivals with the same coolness with which she reorganized an empire. Erzsébet Bathory, enveloped in legends of blood and cruelty, a symbol of how aristocratic power could turn to terror. Phulan Devi, the bandit queen of India, who went from victim to executioner and from outlaw to legislator. Agrippina, mother and murderer, who poisoned to place her son on the throne and died at that same son's hands. We also saw Fanny Kaplan, who nearly changed the course of the 20th century with 3 shots at Lenin, and Delilah, the eternal biblical betrayer, who with a pair of scissors defeated the strongest man of her time. Vera Zasilic, who with a political shot won a jury's acquittal and lit the spark of a movement. Ruth Snyder, who in 1920s New York turned morbid curiosity into mass spectacle. And finally, Tomo Gozen, the legendary samurai, who proved that in war, ferocity had no gender. Put together, the inevitable question is, what unites them? Not all were killers in the strict sense. Some acted out of vengeance, others out of ambition, others for justice or political conviction, and some, like Tomoe, in the context of war. What they truly share is that they defied what was expected of them. In societies where a woman was meant to be a mother, a wife, obedient and silent, they chose to wield a weapon, a poison, or a plan that changed their fate, and in many cases, that of entire nations. The impact of their acts was uneven. Some went down in history as monsters, others as martyrs, and a few as heroines. But all force us to reflect on how female violence has been narrated, feared, and sometimes even mythologized. The fascination with these figures says as much about them as it does about us, about how we understand power, transgression, and gender across history. And here we leave it open to you, viewer. Were these women cruel monsters, victims of a world that pushed them toward violence, or agents of change who broke with an unjust order? The answer, as always in history, is not singular. But what is clear is that their names live on centuries later, because they defied the norms and showed that when a woman crossed the line into power and violence, the world would never be the same.